I'm going to actually do a shortened from my heart presentation tonight. I normally do a 50-slide presentation and it takes about an hour and 15 to 20 minutes. I don't want to do that tonight. I think most of you, from my experience in talking to you tonight, or earlier today, have a firm grasp on what we're facing in the state. You know what the hydrofracking issues are, you know what the pollution questions are. I don't want to have to go through that because some of this slide presentation is directed towards people that don't have that understanding yet. Basically, we got started in the criminalization process through the efforts of a man who I'd like to recognize tonight. His name is Richard Grossman. Some of you might be familiar with his work. He founded democracy schools. He was one of the forces behind the Barnstead, New Hampshire water law that stopped the withdrawal of water up in New Hampshire. He has also worked in several other states across the nation, the program for corporations, law, and democracy. Richard, a close friend of mine, passed away last November, and I'd like to honor him as I normally do with this presentation tonight, because this is a continuation of his work as much as anybody else. So what we get to in this presentation is we go through all the failures of the regulatory system, state by state. We talk about Texas, we talk about Colorado, we talk about New Mexico, we talk about the 32 states in which fracking has taken place. Every one of those states has endured the same kind of cultural disaster, the economic disaster, the environmental pollution. So why is it so astounding that we in New York State are standing up to this? Well, I think it's not astounding at all. I think that several other states probably should have been standing up to it well before this to have given us some comfort. So is there anybody here that doesn't believe that the regulatory system has failed us? Can I see a show of hands? All right, so I'm not going to spend your time and mine this evening to go through all of that. What I would like to point to is that there was a study done by Columbia. I just want to point out the income growth, one of the features that often doesn't get addressed in one of these presentations by a lot of activists, is this shows how much the income growth has occurred in various sectors of our culture in the last almost 30 years. 275% for the top 1%, 65% for the next 19, and as you can see, these are the things that we're still being asked to take severe cuts by that 1%. All those services that service those three lower sectors of our economy. I think it's about time that we talk about that issue much more forcefully as an adjunct to the fracking and invasion that we're all facing as well. Next slide. This is how it's working for you by comparison to the rest of the world. We're on a par with Serbia and Rwanda in terms of the separation of income in these sectors within our community. I personally never thought I'd be standing here saying something of that nature to folks. So the net worth of the top 1% is 225 times more than the combined sectors below it. This is Richard's work, where he says, generation after generation, this tiny minority of people have dictated how we as sovereign people are expecting to conduct our lives, and what the expectation that 1% through its lobbyists, through its ability to control the decision-making process. And as I pointed out this afternoon, we have a governor now who doesn't even use the pretext of democracy. He puts the window dressing of democracy up there, but we have a legislative session that's out right now, and he's going to unilaterally, or at least he proclaims to unilaterally, be in a position politically to make this decision. I walked up to your assemblyman, who's, I'm sorry, I forgot his name.
Anthony Brindisi.
Anthony Brindisi this afternoon, and asked him if he knew of the law under which Governor Cuomo was taking this authority to make this decision between legislative sessions, and he said he didn't understand that. He also pointed out, of course, that the Assembly has passed a law which stipulated that there's no health assessment, that there should not be a decision made until there is a comprehensive health assessment. There's a lot of us that believe that we don't really need a comprehensive health assessment. The evidence that's been shown in 32 states is convincing enough for us. But here you have a governor who proclaims that he has cleaned up the dysfunctionality of the New York State government, and yet will come out and make a decision unilaterally without the elected representatives of the sovereign people of the state of New York having had an opportunity to say no. Next. So this is Richard's work as well. As the 19th century began, constitutions, laws, and customs in the United States denied the overwhelming majority of the people, that included women, people of color, Native Americans, and everybody but white males, the equality before the law, along with the authority to vote. Next slide, please. So the corporate class endured valiant mass resistance in a whole variety of ways. Spike will get into what happens when the injustice of an elected body of our so-called peers exercises the rights of the 1% against the rest. But we've got several acts in the past where the populist movement in the late 1890s is probably one of the preeminent ones. For those of you who aren't familiar with that history, the populist movement almost achieved taking over several state legislators in this country. The Populist Moment by Lawrence Goodwin is a good resource for those of you that would wish to proceed in understanding that history and also justify what I feel and Spike feels in the future is going to be necessary. Next slide. So the corporate state, its culture contrived, and I hope, there's one slide I'd like to read. I'd like to read this one. In a corporate state, law, culture, contrived celebration, and tradition illegitimately clothe directors and executive officers of chartered incorporated businesses and governing authority. This is usurpation. The corporate state nurtures, enables, and expedites such illegitimate governing authority by violence enforced by courts, jails, police, and military force, and by historians. I think that was his jibe for some other historians that he didn't agree with. Less overly ferocious institutions, for profit and non-profit, routinely reinforce that reality. And for some of you, you realize now that even amongst our own environmental groups, some of the NGOs are actually collaborators with this industrial class, with this corporate class, with this 1% that has brought us fracking without representation. This represents what was happening in some corruption cases down in Pennsylvania and Lucerne and Lackawanna counties, where the FBI was called in to clean up that corruption. And it's actually a dig at the DEP down in Pennsylvania as to their ability to clean up the fracking. The FBI says, don't worry, the locals told me I was wasting my time too, because cleaning up corruption in Pennsylvania in those areas is like ending or responding to legitimate fracking concerns. You can see the frack water samples over here, and welcome to Dimmick Township. Compulsory integration. In New York, compulsory integration, as you probably understand, involves anybody within a spacing unit of 640 acres, wherein 60% of the people that live within that spacing unit that is devised and oriented by the industry to their advantage. If you've got 60% within that 640 acres, and now they're proclaiming they want to move that to 1,240 or 1,280, you have effectively eviscerated the rights of the other 40% of the people that live within that landmass. I should say the 40% that own the landmass. So if you've got 60% of the landmass in favor, and you have 40% in resistance, The 60% effectively uses eminent domain through compulsory integration. This was devised by an attorney, Tom West, who's been hired by the oil companies to do this. Now, this is such an egregious effect upon communities, it splinters them effectively in a 60-40 split, or somewhere in between. In Pennsylvania, the conservatives haven't even allowed what they refer to as forced pooling to be instituted. So here, Pennsylvania, that has a gag law, has an Article 13, has these draconian laws in place, in this one instance, is more progressive than New York State. I find that quite interesting, given the cultural differences between the two states. Okay, this is the guts of what I'd like to get into tonight. This is a study, I decided a few months ago to go into the prehistory of the 2005 Energy Policy Act. Everybody familiar here with it? Anybody that's not familiar with that act? This is essentially, as you know, the act that Cheney and the Energy Boys got together in a room, devised to take out all of the environmental laws, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, Community Right to Know Act, the RCRA Act. And I was curious to find if, in fact, there had been criminal penalties previously. In other words, you know, regulatory agencies often have criminal penalties. They're very rarely enacted because you have consent agreements, you have non-disclosure agreements, and other agreements that take place between regulatory agencies and the offending party. In the state of New York, I'm quite familiar with sewage sludge and CAFO pollution. They very often, ag and markets would send out people to farmers and slap them on the hand for having polluted the stream or the next door neighbor, and there's been a dam break and the manure effluent that the soil has never seen in the past goes out and pollutes. They go out in several cases. I investigated over time. They'd slap the hand not only once, it was called voluntary compliance, stop it, don't do it again, but several times. So did we really get the kind of protection that we would want? No. So I was interested to find out at the federal level whether the regulatory agencies had penal jail time for toxic offenders. So in fact, in looking for that, I ran across this study done by the Columbia Law Environmental Journal, and their approach was to examine and advocate for a different way of dealing with environmental crimes. And they were also interested in finding out the same history of what happened before 2005. So they said, when the government can prove that someone has both acted unlawfully and caused or threatened such harm, an effective system should have criminal sanctions in place to address the situation. Next slide. So we went back and looked at these acts that had been essentially decapitated. A coup d'etat, a bloodless coup, take out these acts, and what did they really take out? Did they just take out the regulatory oversight for those acts, or were there criminal penalties? Oh, I had to slip this one in. It's one of my few political slides. It shows Mr. Cheney going through heart transplant, and the old heart is being taken out, and it's a little radioactive with its connections to Halliburton and several other corrosive activities that he'd engaged in. Thank you for going to the next slide. The penalties that were eliminated. This is the Clean Water Act. If you had a knowing violation and it wasn't a toxic dumping of massive proportions, you could be sentenced up to 3 years in prison prior to 2005. If you had knowing endangerment, if you knew that what you were doing, and there's some previous slides in my presentation about a guy down in Pennsylvania by the name of Alan Shipman, who combined sewage sludge, restaurant waste grease, and fracking fluid and for a period of 6 years went through 9 counties in Pennsylvania and dumped that cocktail all over the place, encouraging his people to back into places that had drains that emptied into the streams next door, etc. That kind of knowing endangerment could get you 15 years in prison. Interesting, I followed that through the regulatory system down there. He got a $265,000 fine. He and his wife were told they'd never have this business anymore, and he had to do some community service, and there was another financial penalty that he had to pay as well. But he didn't do any jail time. He did some community service. Yes?
Do you know if anyone ever did jail time under these laws?
Well, I'm getting to that question, and that's one of the things that we were interested to find out too in looking at the EPA history on it. Next slide. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, commonly known as RCRA, wasn't quite as stringent in its penalties, but they did range from 2 for knowing violations to 5 years for knowing endangerment. For those of you that are interested in actually reading those laws, they're accessible online. Clean Air Act also had fees or sentences up to 15 years for knowing endangerment. Now, I've got noted down here in italics that the years represent the maximum authorized incarceration, and that fines were also available. The sentencing guidelines are now discretionary, and so uniform application of graduated punishment factors is not guaranteed. Now, what that really means is very similar to what happens between the regions of DEC. If you have regulations in place, regulations are not laws. How many of you have heard Tony and Grafia speak to this issue of whether regulations are law or not? Okay, 1 or 2 people. Essentially what happens is we have been convinced that this S-Guise is going to come out and be codified, but these are just guidelines for the permitting process that occurs in each region under DEC. So the only law that is enforceable in court is that contract that's signed between the drillers and the DEC. That's a legal contract. That becomes law. That means that if there's an agreed party on either side of that contract, it's enforceable in court. The guidelines are just that. They're guidelines. So when the S-Guise comes out and you read this, you often read this as something that's going to be abided by, that in fact there won't be any of these big pits. If you read the small print, you'll see that those are allowed under certain conditions. So that many people are under impression that all those pits have been eliminated. Not so. And of course, it may be even more egregious as this if and when, and I want to emphasize that because we're not for fracking if, either Spike or I, we're for fracking no, which he'll get into chapter and verse. So we went back and looked at I went back and looked at the sentencing that had taken place for these people that had been under a regulatory system at the national level. I could not find one example of jail time having been served by one of these folks that had polluted. Lots of heavy-duty fines, but for those of you who have examined this in the past, you know that that's a cost of doing business. That's why you have regulatory systems. So business knows what the cost will be if they are caught doing what they shouldn't do. So, in looking at the criminalization, people often ask me, said, well, should we adopt a similar system to what the EPA had back then? I use this as an illustration at the national level of what a regulatory system does and fails to do. So what we want to do with criminalization is to remove it from both the national and state regulatory oversight, state first, hopefully the nation in some future date, put it into the penal system of the state of New York, wherein each one of you living in a community in the state of New York, if you see any fracking activity taking place, you report it to your local police, who then reports it to the district attorney, who then convenes a grand jury. It's spread across the entire state. It's not one person deciding that fracking isn't going to be in your community. It's the entire state deciding that fracking is not going to come into the community. I was asked in the interview tonight, well, how are you going to get this law passed? How do we get laws passed in a democracy, or a lack of democracy? I think the only way we do in something as egregious as this, with the support that's currently pushing these issues, or this issue, is to put a law in place that we've devised ourselves. And that's what public law number 1 is. It emanated out of several grassroots representatives across the state. It can be accessed at several different places, and if you keep going...
Crackbusters New York, Crackbusters New York, or NY, crackbustersny.org.
Here is what it does. It creates felony offenses in all of those categories. Extracting oil or gas via fracking in New York State, mapping, exploring, locating oil and gas deposit with the intent to frack, importing frack-related materials into New York State, including frack wastewater and drill cuttings, withdrawing any New York State water for the purpose of fracking anywhere, which means across the state border, owning or possessing or transporting fracking paraphernalia anywhere in New York State. Our use of paraphernalia is sort of a tongue-in-cheek reference to other laws that might be contemplated by others. But this is serious. We feel that if we're going to have what we want, is there any law that you know of that's been passed in the New York State Legislature that says no to any element of this fracking question that we all face? Has anybody got any law that they know of that's been passed in our favor, where we're coming from? The only thing that's been passed is a water withdrawal bill that allows LLCs to withdraw up to 100,000 gallons per day, a mom and pop operation operating 8 to 10,000 or 6 to 8,000 gallon trucks, delivering 10 or 15, 10 to 12 loads, free of charge to a site on a daily basis. That's our water. And that bill, which we fought very hard in upstate New York and met with all of our elected officials that we could, got passed by both houses. That's the only thing I've seen around fracking that's passed, and now the government's going to make a singular decision. So, in essence, this is what we're proposing, is to have our own law introduced, and this law is open, this is not cast in stone. For those of you who read it, that find something that you wish to add, it's sort of a Wikipedia law. You know, we'll consider any additions that make sense to strengthening the law of the people, and what we're seeking to, between now and the end of this year, is to get 5 sponsors in each house of the legislature to criminalize fracking. And we think it's a tall order, but we're encouraging people to help us do that. And the way that we feel it can be done is resolutions passed at the local level. It'd be like a resolution, a non-binding resolution from your towns, from your counties, from your villages that says we are in favor of this criminalization law that's been introduced on the part of the people of the state of New York, the sovereign people of the state of New York. That's all I have, and I'll entertain any questions you have after Spike's presentation. Thank you very much.